So just for record purposes, I'm Dr. Lai Leong, representing the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. And today, July 22nd, 2014, I'm interviewing Ambassador at Large Chan Heng Chee at the Singapore Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Okay, Ambassador, we may begin talking about U.S. foreign policy priorities in Southeast Asia prior to 9/11. So when you first became ambassador in the late 1990s, how would you describe U.S. foreign policy priorities at that time?
When I arrived in Washington, D.C. in July of 1996, America was enjoying its hegemonic moment. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Union had disintegrated. I think it was 92, 93. And the United States was the only superpower in the world. It was a hegemonic power. I think US foreign policy showed that confidence. And for me, leaving 16 years later, the contrast was very great, because in 2012, when I left, I felt America had lost its confidence. But in 1996, America was enjoying its hegemonic moment. What was its foreign policy like? I believe the Americans and President Clinton then felt that America could do a lot with its power. And the Washington Consensus developed out of that period, that its values could be pushed first in democracy and human rights, and secondly in trying to reshape the world with the good values of America, that American values which was good for business, democracy, good for people's being, and good for general economic growth of the world should be the values for the rest of us in other regions. So there was this sense of the push for the Washington Consensus, which is summarized as deregulation, deregulation, deregulation. So really it was a reshaping of the political order and the economic order. America's military power, diplomatic power, and political power was at its height. Well, military power is still there, and the United States really, even today in 2012, is unsurpassed and unmatched in its military power. But in 1996, when I arrived in the United States before 9/11, all three, were conjoined, and America was the undisputed hegemonic power. I think for us in Asia, in East Asia, we really felt the push for democracy and human rights. In Singapore, we felt it because we had the incident of Michael Fay just a bit before that, 1993-94, where we beat the backside of an American kid. Well, he was a high school kid. I think he was 15 or 16, I've forgotten. And he had vandalized over 20 cars in Singapore, spray paint, and I think maybe a bit of acid with a friend of his, who was a Hong Kong boy actually. But the incident was portrayed as Asian values against Western values, which was all wrong, because there was an Asian boy, involved in it, but that was not how the Western press and American press played it up. So in Singapore, we felt this in sort of a real incident. And we dealt with Michael Fay the way we would have dealt with a Singaporean, And I think for that became a particular episode in U.S.-Singapore relations, where I would say, U.S.-Singapore relations are generally good. But it is a rare moment that we have bad relations, and this was one episode of that. I would characterize Singapore's relationship with the United States as substantively good and atmospherically very good. We normally enjoy good relations. Yes, so good relations is a norm, bad relations is an episode. This was one episode.
What about U.S. foreign policy towards the region in general?
I think the push for democracy and human rights was throughout. When President Clinton came into power, the United States was really pushing human rights so hard that it had, it had bad relations with the entire ASEAN region, because I think there was the Thai Prime Minister who was declared persona non grata. He wasn't allowed to go into the United States because he had some links with, narcotics. President Suharto was declared an authoritarian, so the relationship was not so great. And Singapore was seen as an authoritarian government, and our, caning microphone didn't help. So in Southeast Asia, we had these issues: Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, and I think the United States had a bad relationship with China in the first Clinton administration. In fact, it was so bad that we thought the relationship was going over the cliff. Then I think they pulled back, So it was not a good time for Asia in the first Clinton administration, because it was a hegemonic moment of the United States when I arrived there, So it was really post the end of the Cold War, and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So as a result, that I would say the foreign policy was tough, muscular, somewhat messianic, if you want, And I have to say, the push in the West at that time for the democracy and human rights agenda, the promotion of democracy, those words, became the standard which underlined most foreign policies. And unfortunately, the way it came across to other regions, non-Western regions, was that, we believe in democracy and we want to practice democracy. But if it is pushed so hard by Europe and by the United States at the end of the Cold War, then it becomes a question of cultural imperialism. I think there was a feeling of that. So we push back, not because I think that we don't really believe in the practice of democracy, but it is not the way that it is preached and pushed, by another country. So it's a very natural reaction, particularly by a small country. So I think that was seen to be US foreign policy, that it was about promoting values fully, confidently in the post-Cold War moment, and it was political values as well as reshaping the economic order.
What about in the first 9 months of the Bush administration before 9/11 happened? Was there already a palpable change, or is there more continuity?
Well, I think I would like to add that in the second term of President Clinton, the Clinton foreign policy towards Asia started changing, and he repaired the relationships with Asia. And after all, there was President Clinton agreed to start a bilateral free trade agreement with Singapore in the second term, and his relationship with China was on a better footing. Relationship with ASEAN was not so great because Myanmar was always an issue between the United States and ASEAN. And ASEAN was held hostage to Myanmar, and we told Myanmar that. This was during the Clinton administration, and I'm sad to say that it continued through the Bush administration. Now, in the first 9 months of President Bush's administration, it was very good for Asia and for ASEAN. I think because we complained so much to the out-of-power Republicans that this was how we were treated, that Secretary Madeleine Albright, the Foreign Secretary of State, did not want to meet ASEAN ambassadors because Myanmar was one of the countries in ASEAN. And how could you just neglect a whole region or deny a whole region access to the Secretary of State as a group of the ambassadors simply because of one country? I think we passed that message on, and that we felt a bit neglected, that America traditionally only had eyes for the Middle East and attention for the Middle East and Europe, Russia, post-Cold War. So I think that with that message reach the Republicans who were poised to come back to the administration, and indeed they did come back to the administration. People like Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Armitage, Bob Zoellick, they were engaging embassies, and certainly as ambassador in Washington in 1996, ever since I arrived there, I engaged with the Republicans who were not, in administration, not holding positions in administration. So in the first 9 months of the Bush administration, Bush 43 administration, President Bush made it a point to meet Asian ambassadors. In fact, I think prior to the elections, the Asia policy was defined by a group of them. And it was Richard Armitage et al. Who drew up the policy. And it was about treating allies well and emphasizing relationships with allies and with friends. And this was important, stepping up on that, and which was what President George W. Bush did. And I would say he was very good to ASEAN and to Asia in his administration. To even beyond the 9 months, I would say by and large, President Bush's policy towards Asia and ASEAN was good. In fact, many Asian ambassadors would say, whatever you say of the Bush administration foreign policy in the Middle East and elsewhere, the policy on Asia and on trade was very good. This is the usual conclusion, But in the first 9 months, I say President George W. was good for Asia because, in the first 9 months, he saw so many Asian heads of state and government. It's unprecedented. Of course, the first to walk in the first few months of, there's an order, there's a pecking order to walk into the White House, was Japan, ally, security treaty ally, Second was ROK, the Republic of Korea. Then it was China. And the fourth to go in was Singapore. Now, that had never happened ever before. So we were the fourth country in Asia to go in the first 9 months before September, 9/11. And after us, I believe it was Thailand. I think they would have wanted to welcome Indonesia early, but President Megawati was just, they had the elections, she hadn't taken over. So I believe Megawati visited in October. And Gloria Arroyo also went in then, and Prime Minister Mahathir went in March of 2002. So in one, within the year plus, of the Bush administration, he had received about 4 or 5 countries from ASEAN, which is unprecedented. So in that sense, from the eyes of the ASEAN country, this was a great start, And I think what came in during that period was our concern that the United States, the Bush administration, the Bush team before they became administration, also declared that they would deal with communist China. I remember, was it competitor or was it strategic competitor or was it strategic adversary? Was it a strategic partnership? And I think they decided on strategic competitor, So it was, for most of us, it was really how would President Bush deal with China? In fact, every president that comes in, in the United States will cause this sort of hold your breath moment in ASEAN, in Asian countries. How would the United States deal with China? Because, we've seen so many times, the first administration or the first few years is often, sort of feeling around the policy, they get wrong-footed, and it's a wasted period because it could be a rather strained bilateral relationship. Then it's bad for the region. So when the Bush administration came, given their rather tough talk on China, don't forget it was Paul Wolford and Scooter Libby and Dick Cheney, So I think we were concerned. And this was tested immediately. Now I'm trying to remember, was it April that EP3 happened? The American surveillance plane was buzzed by the Chinese, a plane, and it was forced to land in Hainan Island, and I think the Chinese plane fell, sort of was shot down, So that was a very tense moment. Would the Chinese return the plane? And I think the first few days were very, very tense. What would happen? So soon after the Bush administration came into power, it was tested this way. In the end, cool heads and wise counsel prevailed, and I believe President Herbert Walker Bush, Brent Scowcroft, all these old, foreign policy hands, spoke to President Bush and the new team, and I think in the end the resolution was much more peaceful, and the awkwardness, the strain was worked out. I think we all heaved a sigh of relief. And if I look back, I would say it is just as well the US-China relationship was tested so early in the Bush administration, because I think the two countries came, stared at each other, are we at the brink of war? And then decided they didn't want it, didn't want war, didn't want conflict, and stepped back. And that became the foundation of the relationship later. So, if you ask me what was the relationship before 9/11, it was good with Asia, and that period laid out first, what do you do with the China policy?
So would it be accurate to say then that if the focus on democracy and human rights characterized the Clinton approach, that under the Bush 2, at least in the first 9 months, the focus was much more on trade? Would that be correct?
Well, it was on it was on, in the first 9 months, it was reaching out to Asia. It wasn't so specific as trade. Get to know them, get them in. And I remember the ASEAN ambassadors called on Secretary Colin Powell very early, all of us. And there was a fight about whether it's Myanmar or Burma, And in the end, I remember telling Armitage, look, let's resolve it by just putting flags. Don't put the name of the country. All of us know where to sit. And Secretary Powell had better know the flags, and you can guide it. So, it was always, is it Myanmar or is it Burma? And my my message to Americans is that people in the country call it Myanmar. Burma is a British name. Why do you keep calling it Burma? You see? So I've been pushing it back. You go to Myanmar, and they say, this is Myanmar. So it's Myanmar. And I think the British thought they heard Burma. So, but it's a small thing, but why can't a country be called by the name it wants to be called by? So it's, anyway. But the policy then was to get Asia on the right footing. And let me say that post 9/11, the relationship with Asia and certainly with ASEAN got even closer, because it was the war against terrorism or the struggle against terrorism, and ASEAN has 250 million Muslims, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. And shortly after 9/11, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines found that we had a Islamic group, Muslim group, that was radical jihadist, Jama'iyah Islamiyah, that wanted to bring about a terrorist attack in Singapore, And I think that made the relationship closer. And because of that, the Bush administration paid far greater attention to Southeast Asia because of terrorism. And after a while, then the complaint was, why are we only engaging on terrorism and security matters? But that brought the Bush administration to deal with ASEAN, visit ASEAN countries, principals, their Homeland Security Secretary coming, Law, the Attorney General, Secretary of State, and so on, coming to ASEAN often. So the relationship was good. ASEAN felt that the ball was dropped in the second term, and they felt, ASEAN countries feel, Secretary Condi Rice did not have the appreciation for ASEAN. She was a Europeanist and she was interested in the Middle East and Europe. And out of 4 ASEAN ARF meetings in the region during the second term, she skipped 2. And it was the only serious institutional opportunity for the Secretary of State of the United States to meet with the foreign ministers of ASEAN. And that one trip, she skipped. So I think, and because of that, there was a sense that the Bush administration dropped the ball on ASEAN in the second term. And I've been explaining to the administration officials, you see, for ASEAN, FaceTime is important. And this personal relationship is important. That is the only, institutionalized platform. You can do 1,000 things that are good with ASEAN. You don't show up, then you might as well just have done 10 things. You do 10 things, you show up, you would be considered to have done 500 things. Didn't Yogi Bear say that, really 90% of the time it is about showing up, so that is the thing. And although there were officials who came to Southeast Asia, to ASEAN, I think the sense was that the really top principals didn't come. The Homeland Security Secretary did come, but the really top slots did not come. So I think that was why it was said that ASEAN felt neglected. But I would say that even amidst all that, trade between the United States and Asia and ASEAN was good. We completed the free trade agreement in 2000 and signed the bilateral free trade agreement between Singapore and the United States in 2003. And the United States was at APEC all the time. And in 2008, the United States joined the P4 project, which launched the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And with America joining the P4, which are Singapore, Chile, New Zealand, and Brunei. With the US coming in, it was P5. But instead of calling it P5, it was called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And when the United States came in, they said, why not bring others too? So, Vietnam was brought in, and Australia, Peru, so it became the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so the trade game was always on the radar screen for President Bush, And I think Asia appreciated the Bush administration for that, because the business of Asia is business, and trade and business is strategic.
If I may bring you back to the days around 9/11, what was your reaction and the reaction of your colleagues in Southeast Asia when 9/11 happened?
I think the French headline, "We are all Americans," spoke for the world. I think everybody was so shocked, and when we discovered terrorists in our midst, we took it very seriously, and so we cooperated with the United States. Singapore was one of the early, was it 40 or 50, I forget now, countries that signed on to be in the coalition of the willing. I think it was 50, and we were in the first round. Later, more countries came on because we felt this. And all of us believed there were weapons of mass destruction. And, I think later when people said, well, we would have preferred, let me put it this way, Singapore would have preferred that the United States wait and go through the United Nations. But in the end, it did not. But we felt that if the United States goes in to fight terrorism and to deal with weapons of mass destruction, we should be there with it because the United States cannot be seen to lose.
Did you get a sense in the year or so immediately after 9/11 that indeed there was a shakeup in the international structure, in terms of the structure of international relations, given this war on terror?
I don't know what you mean by shake-up, but I think the United States, President Bush made it very clear, you're either with us or against us. And a lot of people reacted very negatively to that. But what was the shake-up? There was the United States and its willingness to use, willingness to act unilaterally was what was striking. And that you could have a war of choice. I think that was what struck people. And in the end, I think it came back to hit President Bush and cause the negative evaluations and assessment of him and Prime Minister Blair in Europe and amongst the Muslim countries. I think the war of choice, if they had, it's not an idea that sits well. If you win and it's clean, everybody will be with you. If it drags on and is dirty and is messy and doesn't seem to improve anything, and worse still, they couldn't find the weapons of mass destruction, I think that was a problem, a very serious problem. And I know during that time, since we are, discussing for history, a lot of the Muslim countries in my region, in ASEAN, really wanted to, they knew they had to deal with the United States, but they didn't rush to get into the White House because the photo op didn't play so well at home with the Muslim vote, especially near election time. So they were not in a hurry to be seen to be, so cozy with the United States. And so there was a bit of an arm's length. I think it's the visas and the security measures, which, although it didn't say it, targeted Muslims, and Muslim names many are alike, caused a lot of, lost the United States a lot of goodwill. So I remember the Malaysian ambassador Ghazali, Ismail, I think that was his name, said to me, Heng Chee, I now learned the meaning of the word random. We were told it was random checks at the airport. He said random means every time, because he was called every time. So they were not amused.
Was there anxiety in terms of the recognition that the United States is now willing and able to really flex its muscles?
I think initially it was that, but I think seeing how it was bogged down in the war, there was also a realization that, okay, there's Afghanistan, there's Iraq, that how many can you do? And certainly there is a sense that during the time that the United States was bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Chinese saw that they had a window of opportunity to act and move in the region without being checked by the United States.
So did that actually end up lowering American prestige?
The inability to win the war. I mean, globally, I think, it's easy to do, Monday morning quarterbacking, as they say in the United States, and to say, what could have happened. And I'm not a military person, but a lot of the opinion then did suggest that the war was not competently executed. It was the execution of the war. It was not competently executed, and I think now we see the impact. And so I think that started people thinking, you can't put Iraq back together again. And in 2014, we see the problems. After all this, you come back to this. Are you going to have the fragmentation of Iraq? And now we have Syria, ISIS. It's Middle East is a very difficult and complex
Has that been a surprise for the countries in Southeast Asia to see this unfolding?
I think the way it has happened so rapidly and so dramatically and brutally, yes. We always said, oh yeah, they'll have trouble when the autocrats go, what happens? But nobody really imagines how literally like dominoes, the Arab Spring swept through the Maghreb region and, brought about change, but the change did not bring about peace or better, a better time. The question is whether this is a transition and how long the transition will be. Tunisia is said to be doing quite well, but you can't say the same of Libya and Egypt. You can only hold your breath.
Let's talk a little bit more about the what President Bush called second front against terrorism in Southeast Asia. When Southeast Asia sort of heard that term being articulated, what was the reaction?
I think some didn't think too much of it, and they thought indeed it is, and good. Doesn't mean that there'll be more aid and capacity building, Some resented it, so it depends on where you stand. And I think some countries will say it doesn't mean the US will interfere more, in what happens in the country. But I think it worked out all right. The countries did appreciate the capacity building. And I remember being in Washington, and I was amazed how many delegations from Indonesia came to Washington, whether they were lawmakers, defense people, security people, the AG's chambers, intelligence, trying to pick up things.
So this focus on counterterrorism, did Southeast Asia consider it a good thing that the US focused so much on it?
Initially, yes. Later, they got tired and wanted them to move to another page. Look, we don't only want assistance on terror to deal with counterterrorism. What about trade? How about some aid? How about education?
Which countries in the region most welcome counterterrorism efforts and resources?
I think all of us who were affected, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, and Philippines, because of Jemaah Islamiyah, I think for the Muslim countries, they couldn't come out too clearly for it, but we were, Singapore kind of welcomed the sort of ability to cooperate, but sometimes we often felt, oh gosh, we have to be very careful because everything is so leaky.
Did you get a sense that the Bush administration officials were a little simplistic in their approach, in the sense that they just saw everything through the lens of counterterrorism, and that they saw Muslims really as they're all the same?
Well, I do not think in the United States there is a very clear grasp of Islam through all the administrations, even now, and we say simplistic. I suppose that if we are dealing with religious not of our own, you tend to see it not in fine grain, but the broad picture. But you would have expected, given the importance of the war on terror, that the United States would get up to speed, which it didn't so much. I think some understood, but it's not very clear. The full understanding that Muslims in Southeast Asia are not exactly like Muslims in the Middle East. And Middle East Muslims feel that they are like the top of the pile Muslims. They are the cradle of Islamic culture. And there are things that moderate Muslims do in ASEAN. They look, but I don't know how much of it they take. And So,
When you were ambassador there in DC, did you have a sense of how much internal debate there was about policy towards Southeast Asia at that time?
we knew about the differences between state and defense, between Secretary Powell and Rumsfeld, all right? And that the defense people and the vice president's office. Yes, we were aware of that. Yeah, and now it's all written up in the books. And there's Connie Rice's NSC advisor trying to broker it, but not very successfully.
Were you able to play any role in influencing policy making at a time?
I would not want to claim that I influenced policy at any time in that way, because that would be usurping a role for myself too much. But I know the council of Senior Minister Lee Kuan Yew, the words of Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong at that time, and later Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, was welcomed and listened to, by the administration. After all, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the P4 idea, which began as P3, Chile, Singapore, New Zealand, Chile, I think was cooked up by Giorgio, the New Zealand guy, foreign minister, trade minister then, and probably speaking to the Chilean, So we do have some influence, I know I was very, very strong on getting us access, finding formulas to work out how to integrate, how to have Myanmar at the table, and the United States could still deal with ASEAN, And so
Can you talk a little bit more about China? How did evolving American policy in the region make room for the rise of China?
I think China was growing, whether the United States was there or not. But the United States laying out the post-World War II international order of open markets, free flow of trade, investment, technology, helped China. It laid that order. And the fact that the United States, guaranteed, in a way, the peace of the Asia Pacific with the Japanese, by the US-Japan Mutual, Alliance Treaty, sort of laid the peace and security of the region. It laid the order, and the Seventh Fleet going through, created peace in the region and allowed for prosperity. And by that order created after World War II, 4 tigers in Asia emerged, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and ROK. And China also benefited from that order. And wannabe tigers, the second generation of industrializing countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines came up too. I think that helped China. But the main issue in the region was always what sort of relationship would the US have with China, and what sort of relationship would the United States have with China, given that, it has a treaty alliance with Taiwan. How would it treat Taiwan? Would it come to the protection of Taiwan? And I would say that one of the very important things that President George W. Bush did was to, in fact, make it decisive or very clear where the United States stood on the Taiwan issue. Because if you recall, it was the DPP and Chen Shui-bian, yes, Chen Shui-bian, who was, the president of Taiwan then, and Chen Shui-bian was always testing the parameters and trying to get the US involved, and that really embarrassed President Clinton. And dealing with that, and you remember the U.S. The carrier came in Taiwan Straits during President Clinton's time, and 1996 was it. And I think that created some kind of ripples in the Taiwan Straits. Now, President Bush made it very clear that the United States would not go to Taiwan's defense if they provoked the action. If it was on their own accord, they provoked a clash with China, they should not expect the United States to be dragged into the conflict. I think that clear definition, and he made it very clear during his time, how he would, how he read that treaty and what the obligations of the U.S. was very helpful in creating a kind of peace in the Straits. The Chinese didn't get so nervous, and the parties in Taiwan, okay, that's what it is.
Some liberal critics of President Bush would say that it was because his presidency was so focused on security issues and counterterrorism that he went soft on human rights, and in some ways allowed China to spread its political influence in the region. Would you say that's an accurate assessment?
Well, I don't see the link between the two. If you went soft on human rights, why does it naturally lead to China, taking over the region? It's got to do with the security dimension, not the soft values, human rights. All right. Now, I would say because of Iraq and Afghanistan, and after all, the Bush administration was very strong on democracy. They wanted to do nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I would have thought after Iraq and Afghanistan, all Americans should have a great deal more humility about promoting democracy everywhere and recognize that, there are some differences in different countries and regions, and we all want open government. We all want to be free from repression, and torture and so on. We all want good governance. How the form comes, really depends very much on how the country builds. We want rule of law. We want transparency. We want good leaders. We don't want to be, disappear in the middle of the night. Nobody wants that. And as I said, nobody wants torture. So, but how you build that kind of government is, I think, it's tough. And I mean, when I look at the Muslim countries now, it's not so easy to do nation building and democracy building, and when you have tribal associations, sectarian identification and clashes.
Now, if you recall, in President Bush's second inaugural address, he laid a great emphasis on democracy, institutionalizing democracy. Did countries in Southeast Asia at that time think that was just a little too heavy-handed, especially given what's been happening in Afghanistan and Iraq?
Actually, by and large, most Asians now and Southeast Asians know Americans and American president at inaugurals will always talk of democracy. It's in their DNA that democracy is part of the foreign policy. All right, we understand that. So it doesn't surprise us. But in actual action, we didn't see so much of it. They were too wrapped up in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was Myanmar that got the brunt of it from everybody, And I think most Asians see quite some hypocrisy there. Why is Sisi supported? It's a military government. They're getting a package from Congress. But Myanmar had a military government and it was put in the doghouse and isolated and so on. So it's really whether you are strategically important or not. So I think in Asia, we do see the double standards of American democracy.
Speaking in terms of long-term implications and legacy of the presidency, what are your thoughts on that? What sort of Bush's foreign policy, what type of legacy would you say it has passed on to the current president?
I think the President Bush's focus on America's interest in open markets and free flow of trade, investment, and technology is a legacy that has been continued. And the message of the importance of trade and the strategic importance of trade is his message to the next administration. I think there is a negative legacy, which is be careful about unilateralism and be very careful of wars of choice. Don't have to do wars of choice. I think that's a negative legacy because you do leave a thought behind, and that was it. And the positive bit was this. But I have to say this, that President Bush is a very personable leader. Everyone will say that when you meet him, he seems such a nice guy. He pats you on the back, he puts you at ease, and I think many Asian leaders did appreciate that. He could reach out, as President Clinton did, but President Bush did do that. And I felt he put on the stance of anti-intellectualism. I don't read books, which is not true because he read, and he read a lot. But during his presidency, he put out this image that he really doesn't read books. He's every man, he chops wood, with the axe and clears bushes, and so on. But, and I think he made people feel at ease, that he's not going to be the cerebral president that talks, highfalutin issues. I mean, I was in many of the White House meetings right from the start, and I thought he was very together. And what are all these negative press reports on him? Because he was a man who was in charge. He didn't have to look to his lieutenants, the NSC advisor or whatever, to see whether he was saying the right thing. He just conducted the conversation, and he liked to take charge of the conversation.
In respect of your time, if I may just close this interview with a couple of questions for preview later. So the first question actually is, in your dealings with President Bush, is there a particular anecdote that you might relate that illustrates for us what kind of president he was, especially in his relations with Southeast Asia?
I think President Bush, to me, is a very personable president who actually cares about people. I have an episode which will go down in my memoirs, but I had fallen and broken my foot, and I met him in Singapore at the tarmac because the President of the United States was visiting Singapore. I went on crutches to meet him. It was not his first visit to Singapore, it was his second visit to Singapore. And he was forewarned that the ambassador of Singapore would be on crutches. So I was there meeting him, he showed his concern and so on. I think a year later or 2 years later, when I went into the White House with Prime Minister, then ex-Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong, to make a farewell call on him. President Bush said to me, "Ambassador, how's your leg?" So that was the way he was and is. And I said, "Fine." And at that moment, I slipped on the floor in the White House. So, to me, that was, everybody was so stunned. It was hilarious. That's to be put down in my memoirs. And then I picked myself up and went off. And in the afternoon, the senior director of Asian Affairs called me and said, "The president asked me to call you to see how you are and to see how you were." And I said, "I'm fine." And I said, "Why, he's afraid I'm going to sue him." And so the senior director laughed and said, "The president said, tell her not to sue me. I've got a daughter who's getting married and I've got to pay for the wedding," which I thought was just so funny and demonstrated that he's a person, he's got a sense of humor, he remembers, he's caring. So he is a caring president. He's also a president with a sense of humor.
And just very lastly, you know what scholars and researchers and writers have said about U.S. foreign policy towards Southeast Asia during the Bush presidency. Given your unique position as ambassador throughout the presidency, what do you feel is the one thing that they might have missed or that they de-emphasize that you feel is really much more important?
I think the Bush administration sort of hit every button on the relationship continuum, but there was one missing one. And I think it was that not everyone in the cabinet appreciated the importance of cultivating relationships personally in ASEAN. That is extremely important in Asia. And I had mentioned that the Secretary of State, Secretary Rice, did not appreciate that. I think that marked and defined the Bush second term for Asia. So that's a very hard lesson because the Bush administration was not about that. The Bush administration was about developing personal relationships, and he had good relationships with Japan, China, and Korea. But I think there was just one missed beat. And I think Southeast Asia, ASEAN, is very important. And, the administration, Bush administration, got it in the first term, but kind of let it slip in the second term.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. Really appreciate your time.
Well, I said a lot in that period.